Imagine being completely helpless, your wrists and ankles bound to a wooden frame. A masked figure turns a wheel, and slowly, your joints begin to separate. But here's what's truly terrifying. This wasn't just about causing pain. This was about something far more sinister, complete psychological domination. Today we're diving deep into the most feared torture device in history, the rack. But we won't just explore what it did to the body. We'll uncover the dark psychology behind it, and why understanding these methods reveals chilling truths about human nature and power that still apply today. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Robert Greene calls fear the ultimate weapon of controls, and how medieval torturers unknowingly mastered principles of psychological manipulation that would make modern interrogators shudder. But first, let me tell you about the man who designed the most efficient rack in history. His name was Thomas Norton, and in 1447, he wasn't just London's lieutenant of the Tower, he was what we'd call today a psychological operations specialist. Norton understood something that most people miss about torture. The real power wasn't in the pain itself, but in the anticipation of it. Norton's innovation wasn't making the rack more painful, it was making it more psychologically devastating. He realized that the human mind could be broken long before the body. This aligns perfectly with Robert Cialdini's principle of commitment and consistencies. Once someone believes they're helpless, they act helpless. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Norton would bring prisoners to see the rack before using it. He'd demonstrate it on a dummy. He'd let them hear the sounds. Why? Because he understood what neuroscience now proves: anticipation of pain activates the same brain regions as actual pain. The rack became the most feared torture device, not because it was the most painful, but because it was the most psychologically calculated. And Norton's methods reveal three dark principles of human psychology that we still see used today. The first principle Norton mastered was what Robert Greene calls the law of assumed power. In his book, The 48 Laws of Power, Greene explains that perception of power is often more important than actual power. Norton didn't need to use the rack on every prisoner, just the threat was enough. Medieval records show that for every person actually tortured on the rack, 10 others confessed just from seeing it. This is what psychologists now call learned helplessness, minus a concept that wasn't formally identified until Martin Seligman's experiments in the 1960s. Yet Norton was applying it 500 years earlier. The second principle was selective demonstration. Norton would publicly torture one person to psychologically control hundreds. This exploits what Cialdini calls social proof. We look to others' experiences to predict our own fate. But the third principle, this is where it gets truly chilling. Norton understood that the most powerful form of control isn't making someone afraid of you, it's making them afraid of themselves. Let me explain what I mean by that. You see, the rack didn't just stretch the body, it was designed to stretch something far more precious: the victim's sense of identity. And the way it did this reveals a dark truth about human psychology that most people never realize. Modern psychology recognizes something called ego depletion, the idea that our willpower and sense of self are finite resources. Norton's rack was essentially an ego depletion machine, designed to systematically destroy a person's sense of self-control and identity. Here's how it worked. First, the physical restraint removed all sense of agency. You couldn't move, couldn't escape, couldn't even shift positions. This activates what neuroscientists call the freeze responses, a state where higher cognitive functions shut down. Second, the gradual stretching created what we now know as learned predictability. You knew pain was coming, but not when or how much. This uncertainty keeps the amygdala in constant activation, flooding the brain with stress hormones that impair decision-making. But here's the truly insidious part. Norton would often stop the stretching just before permanent damage. Why? because he understood that hope can be more psychologically damaging than despair. When someone thinks they might escape, they become willing to do anything to avoid returning to that state. This creates what Cialdini calls a contrast effect, minus the relief feels so overwhelming that victims become grateful to their torturers. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't named until 1973, but Norton was systematically creating it in the 15th century. And this reveals something disturbing about human nature that most people don't want to acknowledge. The rack's effectiveness wasn't due to some medieval brutality that we've evolved beyond. It worked because it exploited psychological vulnerabilities that are still hardwired into our brains today. We like to think we're more civilized, but are we really? Consider modern interrogation techniques, workplace psychological pressure, or even social media algorithms designed to create addiction. The principles are surprisingly similar. Remove agency, create uncertainty, exploit the contrast effect. Robert Greene argues in Law 15, crush your enemy totally. But Norton understood something more sophisticated. You don't need to crush someone if you can make them crush themselves. The most effective control isn't external force. It's convincing someone that submission is their own choice. This connects to what psychologists call cognitive dissonance submistis. When our actions don't match our self-image, we change our self-image rather than admit we were forced. Norton's victims didn't just confess crimes, they came to believe they were guilty. But understanding these dark aspects of human psychology isn't just about historical curiosity. These same principles are being used around us every day, and recognizing them might be the only way to protect ourselves. Every principle Norton used can be found in Robert Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence: reciprocity, commitment, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. The rack was essentially a machine for exploiting all 6 simultaneously. Think about modern high-pressure sales tactics. They remove your agency with time limits, create uncertainty about availability, use social proof with testimonials, establish authority with credentials, make you like them personally, and create artificial scarcity. Sound familiar? Or consider how social media platforms use variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the same psychological principle that makes gambling addictive. You never know when you'll get likes, comments, or validation, so you keep checking compulsively. The rack has been replaced by subtler instruments of psychological control. Understanding how Norton's methods worked isn't about glorifying torture. It's about recognizing these patterns before they're used on us. Because here's what's truly terrifying. Norton had to physically restrain his victims. Modern psychological manipulation often gets people to restrain themselves. We volunteer our agency, our attention, our decision-making power, but there's one crucial difference between Norton's victims and us. Unlike Norton's victims, we can choose to understand these mechanisms. Knowledge is the antidote to psychological manipulation. When you recognize the pattern, you can break free from it. Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power isn't just about gaining power, it's about recognizing when these laws are being used against you. Cialdini's principles of influence aren't just marketing tools. They're defensive strategies for maintaining your psychological freedom. The next time someone tries to rush you into a decision, remember Norton's time pressure tactics. When someone makes you feel guilty for questioning them, remember how the rack used shame as a weapon. When someone offers you relief after creating a crisis, remember the contrast effect. In the comments below, tell me, have you ever recognized these psychological manipulation tactics being used on you? What situation made you realize someone was trying to control your decision-making process? And if you want to dive deeper into the psychology of power and control, hit that subscribe button, because next week we're exploring an even more disturbing topic, the Spanish Inquisition's use of false confessions, and why innocent people convince themselves they're guilty. You think you'd never confess to something you didn't do? The psychological techniques we'll explore next week might make you reconsider everything you think you know about your own mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. Until next time, stay psychologically aware, and remember, understanding the darkness in human nature isn't about becoming it. It's about never becoming its victim.